Hello, welcome back to the channel. So glad to have you join me today. In this video, we're going on with our look at the book of Daniel. And last week we ended with chapter 4, so today we're picking up at chapter 5. Chapter 5, most people find pretty interesting. I hope that you will. Let's go ahead and jump into our study today, beginning there at verse 1. Look here at what verse 1 says to us. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. So Belshazzar has called together all the important people of the kingdom to a great feast he's throwing. And Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink therein. So here he's doing something evil, something that even his father Nebuchadnezzar would not do. He has demanded that the gold and silver vessels that were stolen from the temple of God in Jerusalem be brought to him, and that him and his party would drink alcohol. They would drink wine from the vessels, desecrating these precious religious vessels. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass and of iron, of wood and of stone. So here they go on with their desecration. They go on with their disrespect of God. They praise these gods of these elements that were spoken of here in this chapter here, or in these verses rather. Now, there were 10 years between the reigns of Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, and those years were filled with murder, intrigue, conspiracy, and political decline. Nebuchadnezzar was succeeded by his son, who reigned for about 2 years, 562 to 560 BC, when he was murdered by his brother-in-law after a brief reign in 559 to 556 BC. The brother-in-law died, leaving Babylon in the hands of his son. He lasted 2 months before being killed by an assassin. Nabonidus took the throne and reigned for about 16 years. He left Babylon in the hands of his son to go off and conquer other lands. So Belshazzar ruled Babylon up until the end of the Babylonian Empire. While Belshazzar was having this feast that is described here in chapter 5, Babylon was surrounded by the Persian army. And Belshazzar considered Babylon to be strong, not able to be attacked because the walls were so high and thick, and at night they closed the city, they closed the gates to the city, and they went down deep into the waters of the Euphrates River that flowed through the middle of the city. And so the Persians, while Belshazzar was partying and having his great feast and greatly dishonoring God by drinking from those vessels that were stolen from the temple, they dug a ditch and diverted the waters of the Euphrates. And as the water level dropped, the Persian army marched into Babylon in the dry riverbed and under the gates. And no one was aware that the city was under attack. All right, let's go on at verse 5. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, "This is the hand of God." God's fixing to show this arrogant, sinful king who is actually in charge. Now, we read a moment ago the son of Nebuchadnezzar. He was actually the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. All right, let's go on here. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. So he clearly saw this hand writing on this wall. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. So now this arrogant king, he's reduced by this act of God's hand writing on his banquet hall wall. He's reduced to great fear. And the fear is so great that the Bible indicates he soiled himself. His knees were knocking together. And that's what we read by his loins were loosed. He soiled himself, and his knees smote one against another. His knees were knocking. He was in great fear. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing and shew me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler of the kingdom. So he could not make them second ruler, because he was second ruler under his father. And so he's going to reward them for being able to share the interpretation of this dream. Then came all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. That means that he grew greatly angry, and they were frightened by his anger and his appearance at their lack of being able to share with him the knowledge of this interpretation. Now, archaeologists have found a room in the ruins of Babylon, which is located in northern Iraq, that was plastered and measured 165 feet by 55 feet. So this could very well be a discovery of the banquet hall that Belshazzar had this drunken feast in, and disrespected God by drinking wine from the implements stolen from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And so at this time, the hand of God comes. 1 hour later, this hand of God comes and writes upon the wall of the banquet hall. All right, let's go on at verse 10. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. And the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in the kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. So this was actually Nebuchadnezzar's grandmother, Belshazzar's grandmother, and the wife of Nebuchadnezzar. And she was there when Nebuchadnezzar called upon Daniel to give the interpretation of his visions. And so she's telling her grandson, call Daniel, who by this time is about 90 years old, and he is still important in the kingdom because he's recognized as a righteous man who's able to interpret these dreams and what have you. So, for as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and shewing of hard sentences and dissolving doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will shew the interpretation. The king was Daniel's. Then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? So he is insulting Daniel. He's reminding Daniel that he was captive, that his grandfather took him captive and brought him to Babylon. Going on, verse 14, and I have heard of thee that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. So this arrogant man won't even give his grandmother credit for telling him of Daniel. He's taking the credit himself. Verse 15, and now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they could not shew the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. So he's making the same offer to Daniel that he made to the wise men who failed in giving the interpretation of this vision, this writing on the wall. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself. Daniel didn't want these gifts. He didn't want this praise. And give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. Daniel reminds him that it was God that granted Nebuchadnezzar the kingdom and of Babylon and the right to rule. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. He's reminding Belteshazzar that he's reminding him that Nebuchadnezzar was a greater king than he was, whom he would slew, and whom he would be kept alive, and whom he would be set up, and whom he would be put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beast, and the dwelling was with the wild beast. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. So he's reminding Belshazzar what we looked at last week in chapter 4, that Nebuchadnezzar, because of his lack of respect for God, was driven out into the fields and became a beast, and you know the rest from the study last week. If you didn't see that, you can go back through the playlist here on the channel and find that study. It's chapter 4 of Daniel, and you can go through that and see about all this. Let's go on to verse 22. And thou, his son, O Belteshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. So Daniel's telling him, he knew all this that Daniel's telling him about his grandfather, and he did not humble himself, because he was told what God's capable of, what God would do in judgment of sin and failure, and a failure to recognize God as the Most High and the giver of power. No government, no king, no ruler has ever had the right to rule or govern except by the gift of God, the power of Almighty God. Let's go on. But hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven. So Daniel's telling him, you have in your arrogance, renounced God. And they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords and thy wives and thy concubines have drunk wine in them. So Daniel's telling him what his sin, what his error against God was. And thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold and brass and wood and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. So Daniel tells him that he's being judged, and God's hand has appeared in his banquet hall after an hour of Belshazzar and his feast and his desecrating God and his worshiping other gods except for the one true God, and his desecration of the implements stolen from the temple. And Daniel's telling him all this, and this is why the judgment has fallen on him. So let's go on at verse 25. And this is the writing that was written. So now here comes the interpretation. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So, he's being told his kingdom has been found wanting by God, and that as punishment, God's going to remove the kingdom from him and give it to the Medes and the Persians. Let's go on at verse 29. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius and the Medes took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So he was 32 years old when he lost his life. Babylon was taken by a warrior king named Cyrus, who wanted to expand his holdings, and so he placed Darius the Mede in charge of the kingdom. So that's the division, the dividing that took place. Cyrus was actually the king, but he gave the right to govern to Darius. And he went off and battled other armies. Now Daniel was about 9 years old when the events of chapter 5 took place. And his importance lay in the fact that Belshazzar's grandmother knew of Daniel and his importance as a righteous man, able to make sense of visions that others could not. So this is what led to Daniel being summoned to give an interpretation of the writing on the wall. Now, as we bring a close to chapter 5, I've got a question. Here's the question in closing. If God's hand, think about this now, if God's hand appeared and wrote on your kitchen wall, what would he write? And what would it mean for you? Think about that and take seriously God. God is to be honored, worshiped, and praised. Because without God, we would not be. We would be nothing. I pray that you've gotten something of value from the study. Pray that you'll join me in the next video. And I appreciate you so much. I really mean that. I'm grateful to you for your taking your time to view these videos. I appreciate you. You take care. You have a blessed day.